Hello, my name is Peter Lowen. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto, an associate director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute, and the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. In this short talk, I want to explore with you some of the ways in which governments are employing artificial intelligence and machine learning. As our earlier sessions have explored, artificial intelligence, or AI, is already in use all around us, from powering our phones and cars, to making recommendations about music, about financial instruments, to underwriting new forms of military conflict. The combination of ubiquitous data, high-powered and high-dimensional computing and computation, and commercial usefulness mean that the rate at which AI is being employed is increasing dramatically. The positive effects of this are massive. If we want to best think about how the use of AI in government can be done, then it's probably helpful to narrow our scope at least a bit. So I want to share with you over the next few minutes 4 ways in which AI is being deployed in governments around the world. And I also want to give you a certain classification of these uses. So let's think about a simple 2x2 table that can organize the way AI is being used. Now, after we explore these different uses, we'll revisit some of the general principles of when AI might be deployed in government. If we want to organize our understanding of how AI is being deployed in governments, let's think about 2 different dimensions. The first dimension is a citizens or bureaucrat dimension. The basic question here is the AI being used or experienced by a citizen, or is it being used by a bureaucrat? Put just a little bit differently, is the AI being used for the public, or is it being used internally by the government? Is it front counter or back office? Second, is the AI being used as a replacement or as an enhancement? On this dimension, we're interested in whether the AI is standing in for something that would previously be done by a person, or whether it's enhancing an already existing process to make it more efficient, accurate, faster, easier. In short, is AI replacing a human or enhancing a human? When we put these 2 dimensions together, we get 4 different scenarios about how governments can be using AI. And we can find ready examples in each of these. So let's imagine them together. Let's walk through them. Let's take first the case of government using AI for interacting with citizens, and in a fashion that replaces a human in the process. A recent case study by McKinsey & Company highlights the use of an automated chatbot by the German Federal Employment Agency. Germans seeking employment insurance or assistance, or employers looking to coordinate benefits, now have the option of interacting not with a human, but with a chatbot. Using a likely combination of natural language processing and reinforcement learning, combined with well-designed surveys, the bot is able to process even complex cases for employment insurance. Previously, it might have been a human bureaucrat reviewing an application or interviewing a citizen, and then making a judgment about their suitability or eligibility for the benefit. Now that process is all automated, but rather than an impersonal website of questions and drop-down menus, the citizen has a more human-like experience of conversing with the bot. Users, for what it's worth, report positive experiences, perhaps because they don't have to share difficult or even embarrassing information about their employment situation with another human. And as McKinsey reports, the chat AI is able to convey a sense of both efficiency and care. What are the upshots here? Well, more people can be served, perhaps more effectively and certainly more efficiently, more quickly. And there's little to no limit on the scale of individuals who can be attended to by this AI chat function at any point in time. Think about that. In an economy where we expect much more volatility in work, and in the need for short-term tide-overs and income security, what a benefit it is to have a machine that can do this without any limit. Importantly, and this moves us into our next cell of a case where we're using AI to enhance a process, this need not come at the cost of the complete or even partial replacement of people. Instead, we could imagine a second scenario in which the AI enhances decision-making by a bureaucrat. Indeed, imagine the chatbot identifies cases in which it feels that a human judgment is required. In those instances, cases can have their uncertainties identified and then be handed off to a government employee who can consider this case and apply a human judgment. Isn't it a potentially better use of resources if we take those who would have previously interacted with all those citizens and redeploy them to cases which require more complex or vexing interactions, or more judgment, or maybe just more empathy? Artificial intelligence applications are not being deployed by governments only or even principally in citizen-facing work. Instead, they're also being widely deployed and used to support so-called back office functions of governments. But as when they are deployed in citizen-facing work, they can be used as a substitute for human actions or as a complement to them. Let's begin with a case of where an AI is enhancing a human function. In their review of the use of AI with American federal government administrative agencies, Daniel Ho and David Engstrom, both Stanford professors, note that the capacity of the state to enforce its laws is a central measure of the capacity of the administrative state. A state that can't enforce its laws isn't much of a state at all. This is perhaps especially true in the case of the regulation of markets. And as Ho and Engstrom document, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the principal regulator of capital markets in the United States, now deploys a large suite of algorithmic tools to help shrink the haystack in its search for malfeasance. This includes a dashboard which captures more than 200 possible indicators of fraud within tax returns. The goal here is not to immediately identify audit targets, but to equip auditors to take deeper, more careful, and more focused examinations of potential tax fraud cases. So here we have an AI helping investigators wade through masses of data, identifying cases, and uncovering patterns they might not have otherwise seen. This is enhancing their work, not replacing it. In related domains, the SEC has developed tools to detect securities fraud. The Advanced Relational Trading Enforcement Metrics Investigation System, Artemis, and the Abnormal Trading and Link Analysis System, Atlas, are both designed to use large amounts of data run through high-dimensional models to help detect cases of insider trading. Importantly, these are not completely automated processes. In the case of Artemis, it depends first on potential cases being identified by officials, and then uses the AI to estimate the likelihoods of fraud. This is an example of an AI technology that helps or augments a human once they've already made a judgment about a potential fraud case. These are not perfect systems. They may be slow to capture fast-changing versions of fraud. They need to be constantly calibrated against real cases to establish ground truths. And they rely on officials who are sufficiently fluent in data-heavy approaches to enforcement to be able to understand and effectively interact with the AI. But when these conditions are met, they provide an incredibly powerful set of tools for putting the law into action. Now finally, let's consider a case in which AI is being used in a back office function, but in a way which by design replaces a human in a process. Government consultations and policy modeling on policies provide a useful example. When considering and designing new policies, governments will often want to understand whether citizens will support the policies, and if adopted, how these policies may change the behaviors of citizens in response to them. We have, over a long period of time, developed behavioral models to understand how citizens will respond to a change policy, whether it's a change in a tax rule, a new health program, or new credit for educational or vocational retraining. But as advanced as our measurement models, our econometric models might be for understanding the effects of policy changes, they do not compare to the power of higher order models working across multiple dimensions, pulling data from thousands of sources. Provided government can create a data environment in which large amounts of data can be linked and analyzed, then the best advances in data analytics and AI can be brought to bear on the toughest policy problems. We can look at policies on more dimensions than we could ever imagine using an AI rather than a human. In smaller applications, this will supplement the work of analysts, but at scale, it holds out the promise of almost completely replacing the often subjective work of human analysts in determining whether a program has worked or not. An AI can consider the effects of a policy across a limitless number of dimensions, and then collect these into a summary judgment about the efficacy of a policy. A human cannot. Humans are not completely out of the loop here. They will need to make the final recommendations about whether a program has worked well enough to be renewed, for example. But all the work of analyzing the effects and efficacy of a program can be left to higher order models, informed by AI and machine learning. In a previous talk, we outlined 4 policy challenges that those in government face. First, people in government are asked to make a large number of decisions. Second, decisions are to be made in a way that is consistent with policy goals and objectives. Third, decisions, especially those that have bearing on the public, and most especially those that have bearing on individuals, should be made in a way that is procedurally fair and consistent with democratic norms. Fourth, we should learn from the decisions that we make. All the applications of AI mentioned here can help us overcome these challenges, both in citizen-facing work and the important work that happens in back offices.
Governments around the world are beginning to explore how they might use AI to deliver public services. And some are already using AI. Some police departments and immigration offices are using facial recognition technology. Some courts and criminal justice systems are using AI-assisted systems for deciding who gets bail or probation. In this video, I'll give you an overview of the emerging tools and frameworks for governing the use of AI in government. Canada was possibly the first country to introduce formal policy on the use of AI in government. Canada's Directive on Automated Decision-Making was introduced in April 2019, with a goal of reducing risks to citizens and institutions and ensuring that the use of AI contributed to efficient, accurate, consistent, and interpretable decisions, consistent with Canadian law. The directive established 5 key requirements. First, government entities planning to deploy an automated decision-making system are required to conduct an algorithmic impact assessment, a self-guided questionnaire intended to guide government officials through a review of the motivation for the use of AI, evaluate its risk profile, flag potential difficulties in explainability, data sources, quality, and risks. The assessment generates impact and mitigation scores, and it's intended to inform thoughtful choices around the use of AI. Second, the directive has transparency requirements, ensuring that notice is given, that an automated decision-making system is being used, providing meaningful explanations to people affected by the decision, making source code available in most cases, and documenting decisions. Third, information about the use of an automated decision-making system is made publicly available. Fourth, the directive requires steps to be taken to ensure that data is relevant, accurate, and up-to-date, and collected in accordance with privacy law, and that there is appropriate opportunity for human intervention. And fifth, the directive requires that people affected by an automated decision have recourse options to challenge the decision. Since 2019, numerous other jurisdictions have enacted similar types of frameworks and requirements. The UK introduced guidelines for AI procurement in June of 2020, with an emphasis on the use of diverse, multidisciplinary teams to contribute expertise in different subject matters like health or data ethics, systems engineering, visualization. The UK guidelines call for conducting data assessment before beginning the procurement process and early attention to the risks and benefits of using AI. They urge government agencies to engage early on with the market to ensure that the systems designed meet government needs and to ensure suppliers have considered the risks of bias, explainability, and unintended consequences. They also urge officials to develop a concrete plan for oversight and governance throughout the life cycle, beyond the procurement decision, including compliance with data ethics guidelines. And in 2021, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, an independent agency sometimes referred to as a congressional watchdog, published a detailed accountability framework for federal agencies. The GAO's framework is built on 4 complementary principles: governance, data, performance, and monitoring. These general principles are explored in terms of key practices, key questions, and audit procedures. The governance principle calls on agencies to define clear goals, roles, and responsibilities, and to engage stakeholders to ensure compliance with relevant laws, regulations, standards, and guidance, and to foster trust and competence. The data principle encourages documentation and assessment of the origin, reliability, interconnectedness, security, privacy, and potential biases in the data used to build and operate an AI system. The performance principle seeks to ensure that metrics and procedures are in place to evaluate how well an AI system is meeting a program's objectives, including the avoidance of bias, and to enable human supervision. Last, the monitoring principle calls for continuous or routine monitoring of a system. The GAO's document provides a great framing of the path we're on with AI. They lay out what they see as 3 waves. The first wave hit a few decades ago with the emergence of expert systems used for things like online tax preparation. The second is hitting now with machine learning, including systems like voice and facial recognition, natural language processing, which allows computers to read and interact with human written text. These second wave systems are relatively narrow, task-based ones. They are built to do a specific thing, like match faces to an existing database of facial images, or determine which of a prepared set of answers to supply to a query about taxes entered into a chat box online. The third wave the GAO identifies moves beyond today's narrow task-based systems to what they call contextual adaptation, systems that can process a much broader understanding of contexts and goals to make increasingly sophisticated and general choices. The example they give is of autonomous ships. The GAO document also provides some helpful graphics with an overview of the phases of an AI lifecycle from design through development, deployment, and continuous monitoring. And another that helps organize thinking about who are the stakeholders involved in the AI system, from software developers to privacy and security experts to users, individuals affected by the system, advocates, and more. It's a really helpful tool for organizing government thinking about this complex new terrain. Countries are not the only jurisdictions getting into the AI procurement and regulation domain. As of 2021, several U.S. states had introduced legislation to govern some aspects of the use of AI in government, from outright bans on the use of facial recognition by police departments to requirements that the use of AI by governments be cataloged and monitored. And entire multi-country regions are working to coordinate on AI policy. One of the most active jurisdictions on data and AI regulation, the European Union, as of 2021, had yet to move beyond general non-binding ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI specifically addressed to procurement. But in the spring of 2021, the EU introduced one of the first comprehensive legislative frameworks for the use of AI, and it will apply to private and public sector entities in the same way. In its current form, the Artificial Intelligence Act would prohibit certain AI applications outright and impose obligations in respect of others, depending on the level of risk to European citizens' health, safety, and fundamental rights. The Act divides AI systems into 3 categories. The first is unacceptable risk systems. These are ones that do things like manipulate individuals through subliminal techniques, or are used for social scoring, or perhaps used for real-time remote biometric identification by law enforcement. The second category is high-risk systems. These are ones that evaluate things like consumer creditworthiness, are used in recruiting or employee management, for biometric identification in non-public spaces, or in safety-critical systems, or in the administration of justice. Then there's limited and minimal risk AI systems, which includes many of the AI applications currently used throughout the business world, such as AI chatbots and AI-powered inventory management. Systems in the unacceptable risk category would no longer be permitted in the European Union if this act passes. High-risk systems would be subject to the largest set of requirements, including human oversight, transparency, cybersecurity, risk management, data quality, monitoring, and reporting obligations. Organizations would be required to conduct conformity assessments for all high-risk AI systems to verify whether they meet applicable regulations and other relevant standards. Systems seen as posing minimal risk would have significantly fewer requirements, primarily in the form of specific transparency obligations. As with its major effort in data regulation, which was the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, and which is responsible for the burst of cookie approvals you now have to click on several times a day, The EU's effort could potentially shape how many countries around the world set AI policy. A couple of things seem clear from looking at this landscape of emerging procurement frameworks. One is that they are very ambitious, as they probably should be. We all want pretty much the same things from our AI in government. We want it to be fair and unbiased, transparent, reliable, efficient, accountable, and to be built using the right kind of data, and to be monitored and overseen by humans all along the way. But at the same time that these frameworks identify these ambitious goals, it's also pretty clear that a lot of government officials asked to implement this vision will be wondering where to start. Our frameworks and guidelines are, for now, just that. They set out fairly general and, let's face it, vague principles. The EU framework, which as of 2021 was still just proposed legislation, provides somewhat more concrete structure, but it's still dominated by fairly general principles. In this sense, government procurement guidelines are like the hundreds of sets of guidelines and principles that we have seen emerge over the past several years in industry and corporate codes of conduct. The real challenge for procurement policy we now face is like the challenge we face in the private sector and civil society. How do we translate principles into practice? Here's one cautionary tale about the challenge of translating ambitious visions and principles into practice. New York City was an early mover in the AI governance world, establishing a task force in 2018 to make recommendations about how the city should manage automated decision-making systems. The task force drew on a diverse group of representatives from government and partners from the private sector, nonprofits, advocacy groups, and research communities. They issued their report in November 2019, but many felt the effort didn't deliver on its goals. In fact, one member called it a spectacular failure, and another called it a waste and a sad precedent. What went wrong? Critics felt like it never got past broad generalities and did not produce the disclosure many sought of where algorithms were in use in city government already. But the biggest challenge was perhaps the threshold one. What is an automated decision system? Does an automated procedure designed by humans and written on paper old-fashioned style, like the NYPD patrol guide, count? City officials worried that every Excel spreadsheet used to automate the millions of decisions reached by all of its many offices would get swept into a new regulatory oversight regime. But other stakeholders, notably civil rights advocates and researchers, didn't want to exclude everything except fancy machine learning systems from oversight, because, as one put it, some of the most powerful forms of automation still run on Excel or in simple scripts. You don't need a multi-million-dollar natural language model to make a dangerous system that makes decisions without human oversight and that has the power to change people's lives. The devil is in the details, and any concrete efforts for the use of AI in government will require getting into many, many details. There's also the problem that asking government agencies to engage in extensive assessment and documentation and consultation can discourage engagement with this challenging agenda from the get-go. Canada has a cautionary tale in this regard. Although Canada was the first country to require algorithmic impact assessments for federal procurement, in 2021, the Canadian Privacy Commissioner reported that the Department of National Defence tested the use of AI without conducting and publishing the assessment. In fact, a newspaper report found that as of February 2021, only one government agency had conducted an AIA, and that was by the government office that produced the requirement. Perhaps that's because answering questions like, are clients in this line of business particularly vulnerable? And are the stakes of the decision very high? Is perhaps easier said than done. or at least not meaningfully answered yes or no. Now, of course, the assessment is only intended to prompt decision making, but for many in government, it's not clear where to go next. Now, that's a challenge we all need to be working on together. Some of the tools I'm developing with colleagues around the globe include certification systems and metrics, automated monitoring and assessment tools, and what I call regulatory technology, like AI systems that can identify potential biases in an automated decision system, or computer software that can achieve compliance with privacy requirements for privacy and security. Building these technologies will require public-private partnerships to create the incentives to make the investment these technologies will require. There's a clear need and role for governments to help foster these techniques, to help solve the responsible AI governance challenge, not only in government procurement, but in the private sector and civil society more generally. And ultimately, we'll need to make sure that the determination of what we want from our AI systems is securely under democratic oversight. Governments, as representatives of citizens and residents, are the ones that will need to translate broadly stated principles into concrete standards and metrics to ensure that we achieve the ambition of AI systems in government that are fair, responsible, effective, and appropriately deployed.